Twins have become a sort of medical mystery that science has been trying to unravel for more than 100 years. The twin birth rate has risen by 70% since 1980, partly due to more women using fertility treatments such as in vitro fertilization. Dr. Nancy Segal has dedicated her career to this topic, having written 9 books on the subject and earned an award for lifetime contributions to twins research. Yet, even after all of this time, there's still so much we don't know about this phenomenon, specifically when it comes to identical twins.
Identical twins result when the fertilized egg or the zygote splits in the first 2 weeks, sometime in the first 2 weeks after conception. But why that happens is absolutely mind-boggling. It's funny because it seems so basic and we study twins all the time, yet this seems to elude our understanding. But I think we're getting closer because there are pockets of people in various places around the world, such as in India, I believe in Pakistan too, where there are these very high concentrations of identical twins. So some people are searching for the genetic factors.
Segal is a professor of psychology and director of the Twin Studies Center at California State University at Fullerton. She says there's a lot more information about fraternal twins, including promising evidence that it's genetic. There are also more known factors that increase the chances of having fraternal twins, like women who are taller and heavier than average, as well as women who are older than 35. On the other hand, everyone has an equal chance of having identical twins, since the embryo split seems to be a purely spontaneous event. The lack of information around twins has contributed to a growing catalog of myths, one of the most prominent ones being that twins have a psychic connection.
Identical twins mostly tend to have this ESP-like behavior, where genetic influences show that they respond to the world the same way, they process information the same way, so they're going to respond to things in very much a coordinated fashion. It has nothing to do with sending secret messages.
However, the bond between many twins is often touted as stronger than that of regular siblings, and Segal says it's often true.
The identical twin bond is reputed to be the closest of all human social ties. And I think there's great evidence to support that from my lab and from the lab of other people. But I think it comes from this understanding of the world in the same way. And we see this even in identical twins raised apart, where they come together for a very short time and they feel closer to one another than they do to the adoptive siblings they were raised with. And that's a very, very informative and very crucial comparison. I mean, it's counterintuitive because you'd think you'd feel closer to people you were raised with, but in fact, they feel closer to the twin they just met. And that's true for fraternal twins also, but it's even stronger for identical twins.
To get a clear picture of all angles of this relationship, Segal is conducting an ongoing study on how the loss of a twin is felt by the surviving sibling and other family members. There's currently around 800 people who've taken her survey. And though fraternal twins are more common, many of her participants are identical. Segal noticed that this group tends to feel the death much more deeply than fraternal twin participants.
And even twins raised apart who've met for a short time feel the loss. Believe me, they do. I've heard from some of them. So I think that the loss is experienced more intensely by identical twins. Now, I did not find big differences between the identical and fraternal, although they were statistically significant. And I think what happened here is that in any volunteer twin population, you're always going to get more identical twins because they're more invested in the relationship. And also, so I think that the fraternal twins who did volunteer were those who were especially bereaved. If I were to get a more representative sampling of fraternals, I think the differences between identical fraternals in terms of bereavement would be a lot larger.
But is this perceived connection organic or a product of the importance society tends to put on twins? Segal says that culture could play a role, but she doesn't think it's significant since she's seen twins who were separated at birth form that deep connection upon a first meeting.
I think what draws them together in part so closely is that most of them were adoptees, raised with people who did not look like them, raised with people who did not act like them. And so when they discover a biological relative and one that's in this celebrated category of twinship, it becomes very, very special. And we find that what's so interesting is that identical twins raised together tend to look for their differences. Identical twins raised apart tend to look for their similarities. They'll stand in front of mirrors and look for dimples and hairlines and all kinds of things. And I think it's not so much the measured traits that are responsible, it's their perception of similarity.
In general, people tend to gravitate towards others who are similar to them. Segal says that this principle is amplified when it comes to twins, especially identical ones.
It's sort of like for non-twins, you're traveling and you meet somebody from your hometown and you immediately feel drawn to them because you have this fundamental thing in common. And I think that happens with twins, only it happens across the board, touching upon so many characteristics.
Another testament to this inherent connection is looking at how the loss is felt when it happens in the womb. Though Segal hasn't studied this subsect of people, the few interviews she's done, as well as other research, shows that the grief is a bit different than how others may feel about a sibling dying in the womb.
It's different in a way, but you always have this sense of promise unfulfilled. What would it have been like? And I think there's a real legitimate grieving process that goes on. Some of these twins will join twin loss support groups and they try to connect with others like them because it's the other twins who've gone through it that mostly understand. And I think that it's, again, this idea that I could have been a twin. Why me? Why my twin brother? Why my twin sister? And sometimes parents, will focus on the twin who was lost as opposed to the twin who survived.
Segal's research focuses more on teens and adults. She says that the death of a twin tends to hit harder when it's a sudden loss of a relatively young, healthy person.
A chronic loss is still difficult, but it's something that you are a little more prepared for. But when it's a sudden loss, such as an accident, a murder, something like that, it becomes, particularly for a young, healthy person. And evolutionary psychology has given this some interpretation in that for identical twins, you lose a whole source of reproductive potential. And that's because any child that you have would be the same relationship to you as any child that your twin has. Right? Regardless of who the partner is. So you would each share exactly 50% of your genes with your own child and with your niece or nephew.
And even though we may not consciously think about this, some research argues that it contributes to this greater feeling of loss.
We grieve differentially for different people. We grieve more for an identical twin than for a non-twin sibling, and more for a non-twin sibling than, say, a grandmother. And why is that? Because there is more reproductive potential in a younger person. And that, I think, is why, in part, we grieve more for a young person than for a much older one, right? Because we pass on common genes through closer relatives, and through younger ones, there's a higher chance of doing so. But again, people don't make calculations in their head. They just act like they do, according to Richard Dawkins, the famous evolutionary biologist.
Segal encourages twins who've lost their sibling to fill out her survey at twinlisttwins.org/survey. You can find more information about Dr. Nancy Segal and all of our guests on our website, radiohealthjournal.org. Our writer-producer is Kristen Farah. Our production manager is Jason Dickey. I'm Greg Johnson.